Hello, I'm Cassandra Taylor from Canteen, where I work as a senior counsellor and a psychosocial team leader for the Canteen Connect team. I'm going to be talking to you today about providing distance counselling and support. But before we jump into that, it's really important to us at Canteen that we do an acknowledgement of country. So Canteen acknowledges Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples are the first people and traditional custodians of this land. We pay respect to elders past, present and future. We're committed to providing inclusive and appropriate support for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, their kin and community. And I'm not in the Canteen office right now, I'm actually at home, but where I am is Gadigal land, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. So I acknowledge them in this presentation today. And I'd also like to acknowledge that some of the ideas that are presented in this presentation today are significant contributions from First Nations clinicians, and they've really enriched my learning in this space. So why are we making this video? We are living in incredibly challenging and difficult times, and I know that a lot of organisations have transitioned from providing primarily in-person and face-to-face services to providing distance support or distance counselling. And what I mean by distance is telephone or web chat or using a video conferencing software like Zoom or Skype or FaceTime. And this is something that Canteen has quite a significant history in providing. So we started a teleweb counselling service in 2014, and we've learnt a lot along the way. I've been involved with that service for coming up to 5 years now. And because of the knowledge that we've gained working in that space, we felt that we wanted to gift some of this knowledge to other organisations so that they can increase their skills in working in this area during the COVID-19 pandemic. So today I'll be talking about particular strategies and techniques that myself and my team engages in when we're doing distance support. But before that, I want to talk about our relationship to technology and also some assumptions that we might be holding about providing distance support, because I know for a lot of people who haven't really worked in that space before, it can feel quite intimidating, and it certainly did to me 5 years ago when I first started out, because my previous work history had been in hospitals and of course entirely in person. So thinking about technology and ourselves to start with, during these times when we're practicing social distancing techniques or self-isolation, or some folks will be in quarantine, what kind of role is technology playing for us during this pandemic? How are you keeping in contact and having important conversations with both your loved ones and your colleagues? And I would say that for most of us, the only option we have at this point is technology. At Canteen, we are primarily working from home at this point in time, and we are staying in touch in different ways with colleagues all across Australia and also Aotearoa, New Zealand. But even prior to the situation that we have now with COVID, did you also engage with technology in really meaningful ways to stay in touch with loved ones? If your social media feeds are anything like mine, you are probably learning about people's graduations from university or engagements or birth of their children or buying a house or birth of grandchildren, a lot of the time via technological means. And I think most people would say that they don't feel any less involved or informed about people's lives if these updates come via some kind of technological means rather than being delivered in person. The way that the world is, we often have friends all around the country and even internationally, and so it's a really useful way of keeping in touch with people. And in the context of Canteen, where we're predominantly working with young people, this is really their world. Their way of connecting and their way of socializing is very often through a digital means. And so what I take away from this is that perhaps, particularly if you're working in a youth organization, the transition to distance support or engaging with therapeutic support via technology may not feel as strange for the people that you're working with as you might think it does. So let's talk about assumptions that we might hold about distance support. And I have to say that before I started working in this space, I certainly held some of these too. So we might assume that it's not as effective, that it's not people's preference, that it's the last resort when no face-to-face is available, that it's awkward, that young people don't like talking on the phone, or really any person doesn't like talking on the phone, and many, many more. Perhaps some are coming to your mind now as I'm speaking. But what's really important is that we're mindful of the assumptions that we're holding so that we can work with them. Meaning that we don't want the assumptions that we're holding to impact the kind of services that we offer, the referrals that we make, or how we show up in the distance space. So if you're carrying a sense that engaging in therapeutic support via teleconferencing is awkward, you're probably going to bring a bit of awkward energy into that space that may not have existed if you were able to mindfully put aside that assumption while you were working. Now, I actually created a lot of the content for this presentation prior to the circumstances of COVID-19. But I think it's become even more relevant now, thinking about why or when distance support might actually be the preference. When there is a pandemic, I didn't see that one coming, but this is where we're at now. But of course, there are plenty of other reasons why it might be the preference, such as people that have caring responsibilities for children or siblings or parents, when actually leaving the house would be hugely disruptive to their life. For some folks, leaving home causes anxiety. For some people, interacting in person can cause a lot of anxiety. For some people, they feel like if they don't need to be in the same physical space as a worker, they might be able to tell you more kind of detailed and deep information faster because they don't have to maintain eye contact with you. They don't have to think about the positioning of their body. They're more free to just speak from a stream of consciousness. For many folks, transport can be an issue. So there may not be adequate public transport, or they're not able to get a lift somewhere. Or some people travel frequently for different types of jobs. And I've certainly worked with some young people in this position where they're traveling to different sites to do field work, for example. Makes it incredibly difficult to engage with a traditional therapeutic support service because they're never in the same place for long enough to build that relationship. Of course, in regional areas, there may be some support available. However, that person may be related to you in some way. So they could be your former teacher's partner, or they could be a family friend, or somehow holding a dual relationship with you that means actually accessing remote support would allow you to keep more of a sense of privacy and confidentiality. You're not going to run into your therapist in Woolworths, for example. Some folks require a later appointment, and often providing distance support makes that possible. Or they want ad hoc support or flexibility, and that's something that Canteen offers via a web chat service. So people can pop on even without a booked appointment and speak to a counsellor. Unfortunately, some people have had poor experiences of in-person counselling, and for that reason, they feel like they'd like to try something new. And of course, web chat specifically. Now, I know a lot of organizations may not be using web chat software, but I would like you to consider it because you will access a whole new group of people that your service wasn't able to access before. Because some people are really just able to express themselves better in the written word. Some find it really overwhelming or difficult to try to keep pace with their cognitive abilities. People with ASD or anxiety, hearing or speech differences, all sorts of different people really just might prefer to type. Even for myself personally, I find I can often express myself better in the written word rather than verbally. And so there are many reasons that people might feel more comfortable in that space. The world is also kind of trending in this direction, and you may be aware that there are already a number of services online where people can access distance support with professional counsellors, such as BetterHelp. And from a social justice perspective, I also think this is an issue of equity, because when we provide distance support, as long as the person has a phone line or an internet connection or even mobile data, they can access really specialized support services such as Canteen, no matter where they are. So they don't have to live in a capital city and have the privilege of being able to use transport and things like that. Lifeline piloted, and I believe is continuing to use, a texting service, which I think is incredibly innovative. And there was a study done on that pilot and what they found in offering this really unique service. The results, I think, are quite incredible, which is why I wanted to include them here. So people reported that being able to text helped them to feel safer, more in control, less distressed, and more confident in their ability to cope. And interestingly, to the point earlier about web chat, people reported that without hearing the human voice, texters also felt less likely to be judged, which I think is quite a remarkable outcome that I wouldn't have anticipated. One person in this study said, "I just didn't want to cry on the phone the entire time." And that's very understandable. Quite stunningly, 42% of people who texted said that they would not have sought help via phone or another service if the text line was not available. So I think that is a really stunning finding that we need to pay attention to. And when you're thinking about planning for your service and how you want to offer support going forward, perhaps even beyond the pandemic, really offering different modes of support is an opportunity for your service to reach people that it has never reached before, maybe 42% more people. They also found that a lot of underrepresented groups were represented well in the text line service. So men who we know unfortunately have a high rate of suicide completion, people in regional and remote areas, people with a disability, and also First Nations folks were accessing the text line with greater frequency than a traditional counselling service. They also found that people from the LGBTQI community were texting a lot more as well. And really disappointingly, the reason that they didn't want to access traditional counselling is because 71% of folks from that community said that they anticipated discrimination in that space. And they felt that if they could text, perhaps they would be able to avoid that discrimination. If you wanted to read a little bit more, I just grabbed these from a Sydney Morning Herald article, which I have linked below. So let's talk about some of the more specific techniques that my team uses in the distance support space. So firstly, we're going to start right at the very start of engaging with people, and that's talking about practices of welcome. So this idea of practices of welcome is a really beautiful micro practice of narrative therapy that came from Auntie Barbara Wingard in Ghana country, which is Adelaide. And it's thinking about, I guess, ways of building rapport and engagement. So before you're even speaking to this person who's going to engage with your service, how are you welcoming them in? What things are you really intentionally doing to create a space of welcome? Remembering that people that are accessing the services that we provide are often in positions where they're very, very distressed, and they actually don't want to become part of the community of your service. So with that in mind, it becomes even more important to find ways to help people to feel welcome. You might want to start thinking about ways that your service is already engaging in practices of welcome in the in-person space, and whether some of these might be adapted for distance support. So for example, I think it would be fairly common when people come into an office to be offered tea or coffee or water, a comfy place to sit, maybe a bit of reading material while they're waiting for their appointment. Are there ways that you could adapt that to the distance space? Could you create a little care package to put in the post for the person with a special tea bag and say, I'm going to call you at 3 p.m. on Tuesday. When I do, Make sure you've got this tea ready so that you're all comfy and cozy. You're in a safe and quiet space, and you can enjoy the tea while we talk about what's been going on for you lately. Make sure that you are feeling really confident about how to introduce the idea of distance support, particularly for people who may have never accessed support via a distance means before. So making sure that in your head, you're feeling confident and clear about how it's going to work, so you can pass on that confidence and clarity to the people that you're working with. Making sure that people have thought about where they're going to sit while they're talking to you. It needs to be a confidential space so that people feel like they can talk openly and honestly, but that doesn't necessarily have to be someone's bedroom. So I've spoken to young people in a number of interesting situations, like a beach when there was no one else around, or a park. I even spoke to a young man who lived in the country, and he would walk around his cow paddocks, and every now and again I would hear a cow moo in the background, which was very delightful for me. But it allowed him to walk and talk, and having that movement during counselling, I think, actually made it a bit easier for him to engage with me rather than sitting in a static position. Making sure that part of your practices of welcome are how you're introducing yourself. So particularly if you're not using software for teleconferencing or video conferencing, that people can get a sense of who you are as a person, because ordinarily when they would come into the office and see you, they would be able to make guesses about your age, perhaps guesses about your gender or your ethnicity, your interests, all sorts of different things that they would gather just from being able to see you. So how can you introduce parts of yourself to the person without them having the chance to see you, if that's the circumstances that you're in? Would you consider writing a small profile about yourself and saying, you know, this is what I do. I primarily use these therapeutic frameworks. This is the experience that I have. In my free time, I really like gardening or cooking or playing with my cat. What would you be willing to disclose? Would you be willing to include a headshot or a picture of yourself somehow? What's allowable within your agency? Having a bit of a think about how you can create an identity that you can show people so that they feel more connected to you. I also think that sometimes it's important to acknowledge that distance counselling might be weird, but not assuming that people are finding it weird, as I mentioned before. So sometimes when I'm talking to a new young person and they sound a little bit hesitant, or perhaps aren't saying a lot to begin with, I'll usually say something like, hey, I know that you can't see me and I can't see you, and might feel a bit strange talking to a total stranger about some of the most intimate details of your life, but I'm going to do everything that I can to make you feel as comfortable as I possibly can. And usually once I've named that and kind of broken the ice with that, there doesn't really seem to be a problem going forward. But I wouldn't walk into those kind of conversations with the assumption that people find it weird, because as I mentioned before, lots of people, and of all ages, not just young people, are very well versed in using technology to have important and meaningful conversations. So let's talk about the tools and resources that you might have available to you. I think that people can get very stuck and fixed in using one particular form of communication and forget that many of us working for support organizations have a whole bunch of things that we could try, like sending snail mail for letters and resource packages, using email, text message, telephone, web chat software such as Intercom, which is what Canteen uses, using online communities. So if you'd like to see an example of an online community, you can search for Canteen Connect or Canteen Connect for Parents and see the way that we use resources and blogs and discussions to actually create a whole other realm of communication, which includes both professional support and peer support. Video conferencing software like Zoom, which I'm using right now to record this for you, and get creative with these things. Maybe you've even got more options than that that I haven't thought of yet. So I hope that you can think about what is available and how you can use it in new and exciting ways. So how could you use these different forms of Technology. You could text pictures. So if you have a work mobile, you can often text people coping strategy ideas or mindfulness scripts, YouTube videos, stories, articles that you might read together during your appointment, or videos that you might watch together during the session. If you have a Pinterest account, which I would really recommend to anyone that's working in the therapeutic space, they have lots of really cool infographics that you can use that have descriptions of all sorts of things, like different therapeutic approaches and coping strategies and self-care ideas, and they're really engaging and beautiful. You could send an app. So we are probably all familiar with lots of different mindfulness or meditation apps. They've really taken off in recent times. Of course, there are also podcasts now, which are really relevant to the work that a lot of us are doing. So for Canteen, Griefcast would be a very relevant podcast. Then, of course, there are many, many blogs that are drawing on lived experience and also on professional knowledge. So for us, Cancer Chicks or What's Your Grief would be examples of useful blogs to use in a session. Or Instagram. So interestingly, there are lots of Instagram therapists that are popping up, and they're posting all sorts of interesting quotes and ideas and links. Or there are some pages that write brief poetry or write really interesting, insightful philosophical quotes, like Morgan Harper Nichols. She's one of my personal favorites. So if you were working with a young person, particularly someone who was feeling quite hesitant to engage, you might spend a good half an hour scrolling through Morgan Harper Nichols' Instagram with them and talking about which quotes stand out for them, how that relates to their life, what does it mean to them, who does it remind them of, how did they form that relationship with that person. There are so many possibilities from just simply scrolling through an Instagram account. The novelty of snail mail. So I do want to put a disclaimer that we need to follow health advice on sending resources at the moment via post because of potential contagion. But this is something that my team was engaging in quite frequently prior to COVID. So we would send young people perhaps a self-care pack or an alternative to self-harm pack, or perhaps a personalized therapeutic letter and a decorated envelope. That was something that I did quite frequently. Sharing photos of them and their loved ones, particularly in grief work, but probably really in any kind of work, it could be lovely to receive some family pictures or pictures of their loved ones and community that you can discuss. Who are all these people? What are your favorite memories with them? How did you get connected to them? What impact have they had on your life, and what impact have you had on their life? Also sharing photos of artwork that really resonates with their lived experience, or their pets and other important creatures in their life, their home environment and important places. These are all really lovely ways of starting to get to know people and hearing some stories that perhaps you wouldn't have heard otherwise. Also being mindful of ethics in this space. So if you have devices that are used both for work and personal use, making sure that you're not backing up any client data onto personal cloud accounts, and also making sure that people are aware that you are not monitoring your email or your phone 24 hours a day and 7 days a week, unless you are, of course. But I think for most of us, we have set business hours, and so that means that we need to set the expectation for people that if they email us at 12 midnight, we're not going to see that until the next day. That's just a way to keep both us and them safe, and help link them in with crisis services, of course, if that's what they need, that are available 24/7. So here's some more detail about ways that my team engages with people in the distance space. I sometimes have heard people think that phone counselling is just a case of picking up the phone and saying to someone what's been happening this week. But I assure you that we engage in things far more interesting and exciting than that. So for example, one of the very clever counsellors in my team created this activity called Cancer Through Our Eyes, which was about creating an artwork that showed a pair of eyes and the impact of seeing cancer on those eyes. So the counsellor herself created a collage, and I believe that the young person drew a pair of eyes. And the counsellor was speaking from their own experience as an oncology counsellor. And throughout the week, they were able to text or email each other updates of making their artwork. And then when they finally had their appointment together, talked through why they created what they created and what it meant. And then extending that activity even further, the counsellor had the young person's permission to share this artwork with the other counsellors in my team, and that we could share it with the young people that we were working with, get them to create their own artwork and provide a response back to the original young person, which we all do via the counsellors and anonymously to protect the young people's identity. But a really lovely way of connecting people up over a shared experience. The jar is an extended metaphor piece that I co-authored with one of the young people that I'm working with, which was really her describing her relationship with emotional avoidance. So both the upsides and the downsides of putting all her emotions away or bottling them up, as a lot of people say. And we wrote this together, and then similarly, with that young person's consent and anonymously, I was able to share that with a bunch of other young people, and they have written back to her about a dozen responses to how they related to what she'd said about bottling up emotions. And this has been quite a remarkable exercise because the original young person who wrote the jar with me had been having a lot of troubles with loneliness. Loneliness was showing up in her life quite a lot, which I think is a very pertinent theme at the moment. And there weren't a lot of practical ways for me to link her in with new friends or a new community, but we were actually able to combat that sense of loneliness by getting the responses from other people about how they related to her work on the jar. And then because so many people related to it, she felt like perhaps this was a common humanity experience, that perhaps it wasn't some kind of failing, and that she was connected to a lot of people who shared those sentiments. My team also uses a lot of metaphors from youth culture and children's cultures and local knowledge. So if you've seen the Netflix series Stranger Things, this will make sense. And if you haven't, it won't make any sense at all. But in Stranger Things, there is an upside down, which is really like a version of the world, which is similar to the regular world, except that everything is dark and terrifying and it's very easy to get lost. And at Canteen, we often say that cancer turns your world upside down. And so I was talking to a young person who really, really loved this show, Stranger Things. And we talked about how perhaps it was just like cancer being in her life and her mum being unwell was just like being in the upside down. And what kind of skills could she use, much like a character in Stranger Things called 11, what kind of skills did 11 have and did she have that could help to minimize the impact of the upside down on her regular life? And she connected with that really well. We've also used a lot of Marvel and DC superheroes to talk about values from an acceptance and commitment therapy framework. And Harry Potter, which many young people and other people do not see as a significant text about grief, but it actually is. So there are a lot of ways of using pop culture to talk about common human experiences. So Harry is a young man who has lost both of his parents, and a lot of the people that we work with are young people who have lost one or both of their parents. And how did Harry deal with grief? How did he stay connected to his parents despite them being not physically present? How did he form relationships with others, and how do they experience grief as other characters in that story die? Google It is a very cool game that a former colleague of mine introduced to me, which is where you are inviting people to Google image search their answers to a series of questions that you construct for them. So you might start out very light and very easy and ask Google a picture of your favorite food, or Google a picture of your dream holiday location, and then move into a more therapeutic territory. So asking them to Google a picture of their experience of grief, or Google a picture of what you think loneliness looks like for other people. It's a really great way to get to know people, and works with people of all ages, really, from the very youngest folks that we work with at Canteen up until the very eldest. And I think you could absolutely adapt it for adults as well. Reading stories is something that we engage in too, even though perhaps that might seem like quite a juvenile thing to do. I think when people are feeling really distressed, there's nothing more comforting than having a story read to them that has some kind of therapeutic content. So one of my personal favorites is a book by Sean Tan called The Red Tree, which may appear to simply be a children's picture book, but actually I think is a story about recovering from depression. It's very, very beautiful. And so reading that to young people and being able to share the images with them in different ways, and then chatting to them about how they related to that story. Deborah's funeral is another example, but there are many, many examples that would be relevant to your particular work context. And yeah, help young people to connect with ideas and gain language that perhaps they didn't have to describe their own experience. I use predominantly narrative therapy in my work, so I'm very interested in how to adapt narrative therapy techniques to distance support. The Tree of Life and the Team of Life are two activities that are very easily adapted to that space. And at the end of this presentation, you'll see some links to the Dulwich Centre to find the instructions for using those activities. And of course, from an ACT perspective as well, that can certainly be adapted to the distance space. So you can do guided meditation and grounding exercises, values work, and of course, the usual conversations that you're having in ACT and sharing metaphors and things like that through distance. I've even done guided meditation via web chat. You just have to be checking in with people more often for the cues that you would normally be getting visually. So making sure that you're checking, have they had a breath? Have they been planting their feet firmly on the ground? Have they noticed their mind wandering off, and are they bringing it back? Making your work sustainable. So as much as is possible, I think in distance work, we need to ensure that we're engaging in helpful collaborations with other services that the people you're working with are involved in. So their family, school, GP, mental health service, or other services that they're involved with, like a family referral service. How do we make sure that we're communicating really, really well with those services so that we can really have support that is really gathered around the people that we're working with? One way that perhaps you might do that, that I've been experimenting with lately, is letter writing to catch other people up on the progress and changes that have happened in people's lives. So if people have made significant progress in counselling, and you've noticed they've had this quite remarkable breakthrough, then documenting that, writing it down together, capturing the person's words in their own language to talk about how did this come to be? When did you notice these big changes? And then chatting with them about who the significant people are in their life that need to be caught up on this really great news. So of course, you're always doing this with complete transparency and consent, but you can offer these letters to people, perhaps other services, family, friends, or teachers, or whoever it might be. And you can also invite those people to send a response back to you that you can share with the person in your next session. And I found that that is a way of ensuring that these changes that have happened in session continue outside of session as well, because the important people in that person's life are saying, wow, this person's changed now. And so my interactions with them and my behavior with them needs to change accordingly. And finally, this one is really specific to the times that we're living in right now, which are incredibly challenging and difficult. In thinking about the impacts that the COVID-19 was going to have on Canteen's community, I started thinking about how many of the young folks that we work with actually already have faced really significant hardships and developed some incredible skills in living that could be translated into skills for living in a time of a pandemic. And you similarly are probably working with people that have these skills as well, that we need to reconnect them with, rather than suggesting perhaps what we might think is best. What have they used before that's actually really worked for them? They might have skills in coping with uncertainty or getting by with less or in times of scarcity. People that have had cancer generally have some serious staying at home superpowers because they've had to isolate before. This is not necessarily a new experience for them. They've found ways to stay connected in isolation. They've found ways to keep loneliness at bay, and they've found community in really unconventional spaces. Now, this is becoming more of a norm for the world now. I'm reading all sorts of interesting articles about people having virtual dance parties and book club via FaceTime and things like that. But a lot of folks that I'm working with were doing things like that well before the pandemic came around. So perhaps you and your colleagues might like to think about how to create a collective document that captures these skills in living, or start some kind of collective project. So the image that you can see on this slide here is from a collective children's art project in Italy, where of course COVID has been extremely terrible for the whole community. But children have been creating these really beautiful artworks that say in English, everything will be okay. And usually they have a rainbow in them as well. You can Google that if you want to see more about that. But I found it incredibly beautiful that children were really finding ways to encourage the community that everything was going to be okay, and sharing these artworks and beautiful sentiments with each other via social media. So that's an example of a way that you could engage the people that are accessing your services in a collective way and allow them to make a contribution to improving other people's lives at this time, which I think is so meaningful. If you'd like to read more about some of the things that I've mentioned today, practices of welcome, there is an article and I believe a video as well about that on the Dulwich Centre website, as well as writings on therapeutic letters, using the tree of life and the team of life. Another favourite for us is the Centre for Clinical Interventions, who provide a whole lot of PDFs on just about everything you can imagine in the therapeutic space. One of the ones that I like to use the most is the sleep hygiene PDF. So it has something like 25 evidence-based suggestions for improving your sleep hygiene. And you can easily spend a whole session talking to someone about which of those strategies they've tried before, which of them they might try next time, which they think won't work or perhaps might work for someone else that they know. And of course, there are a lot of free ACT resources online as well. So Russ Harris is an incredibly generous person, and on his website, Act Mindfully, you'll find all sorts of PDFs and things that you can share and use with your clients. We really want to wish you all the best from everyone at Canteen. Stay safe, keep well, and I hope that this has given you some ideas for how you might work with the people who are consulting you at this time, and we'll see you around. Bye.